Okay, welcome to part 3 of 5 Millennia of Jewish History, Rabbis, Renaissance, and Reclamation. And we start right after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. After the destruction, Jerusalem is a heap of ruins and rubble. Of course, the temple is destroyed. And this is a tragedy and a devastation on a scale not seen before or since. The amount of casualties, the amount of displacement, and also the amount of kind of national bleakness and gloominess that resulted from the destruction of the epicenter of Jewish life. And of course, as is common with Jewish history, whenever things go really poorly, the process to rebuild starts right away. So right after, there's a tremendous shift in the trend that we're going to really investigate today of what happens right after the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is destroyed. There's tremendous shifts that happen to the nation. And we see this, of course, multiple times in Jewish history. When things really, really go bad in terrible ways, the process of rebuilding starts right away. We could say, it's almost an exact parallel of what happened to the Jewish people during World War II, during the Holocaust. And right afterwards, the efforts to rebuild the nation begin in earnest. So there's going to be two major shifts that are going to positively impact the people and going to help them rebuild from the ashes. The first one is, who has the ear of the people? What are the leadership positions and individuals that control the nation? Previously, there were the Sadducees, that they were controlling the high court. The Essenes were also fighting for a major stake amongst the leadership of the people, the Jewish Christians and the Hellenists. After the temple is destroyed, really all that goes away. The leadership from then on is going to be the rabbis and the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the convention of rabbis that control Jewish law, of course, but also are going to be the eyes of the people, the visionaries of the people, and they're going to assume the mantle of absolute authority over the people. And this is the first time really in Jewish history that we've had that. We had during times of Moses, well, Moses fulfilled all the leadership roles, Moses and Joshua, but we had judges, and we had prophets, and we had high priests, and we had kings, and we had local proxy leaders. The Romans instituted leaders as proxies of the people. We have various warring factions amongst the people, and now the only thing that's left, the only office, the only institution that prevailed throughout all this history is the Sanhedrin, which is the rabbinic leadership of the people, and of course the rabbis. And indeed, we spoke about this briefly at the end of last talk. We see the impact of the visionary Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he had to ensure that the Jewish people will prevail. The Sanhedrin is going to do tremendous Herculean efforts to rebuild the nation. And when he encountered Vespasian, and he offered him to, have 3 requests, like the genie on the doorstep of destruction of Jerusalem. What are the 3 requests? The first thing he asked was to spare Yavne. Yavne is the city of the Sanhedrin, and its scholars. And those scholars in the city of Yavne are going to put the pieces back together of the Jewish people and rebuild it so fast that almost like we have in the Holocaust, where the Jewish people today are arguably stronger as a nation than we were 100 years ago, despite the fact that we underwent the worst genocide in all of human history only 75 years ago. We're stronger. How is that? Because we rebuilt and we consolidated as well. From then on, the nationalistic ambitions are going to be much smaller, and we'll see that really almost disappear over the course of our story. And the Torah, as almost a portable homeland, is going to be the hope and the ambition and the yearning of the collective national mission. Over the ensuing centuries, the Jewish people are going to have leaders in the form of the Reish Galusa, known as the Etzel Ark in Babylon, and the Nasi, the prince, in Israel, and they're going to be descendants of Hillel. Now, Hillel is a very, very famous Jewish leader. He actually emerges before the temple is destroyed, but he's someone who comes from Babylon, and he's very poor, but he's a tremendous Torah scholar, and he's a direct descendant of King David. And like we mentioned in the previous talk, from the family in the house of David, that's the family of leadership and royalty amongst the people. So Hillel is going to assume the mantle of a Nasi, the prince of the Jewish people, the head, the rabbinic leader of the people. And the house of Hillel is going to be the consecutive leaders, the rabbinic, but really the rabbinic and everything else, political and otherwise, leadership of the people for the next 400 or 500 years. Now, the shift number 2 that happened, so we have shift number 1 is who's going to be the leadership of the people. Shift number 2 is that what's going to be the focus, the goal of the nation. They weren't like the Romans. They weren't into sports or military or war. Their nation was disbanded. They didn't have any non-sacred literature. The only literature the Jewish people had was the Torah. They didn't have the drama of the gladiators and the public spectacles of dancers and other forms of immorality that were prevalent at the time. What were the people doing? What was their social and cultural life like? And what we learn about this period, tremendously important period in history, is that the change that happened with the destruction of Jerusalem actually brought a lot of good consequences. Primarily being the fact that the nation is reformatted, reframed, and reoriented towards their true role, and that is Torah. So, for example, we see the rise of the Yarchei Kala. Yarchei Kala is the 2 months of study. It was biannual national conventions of Torah study. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, beginning in this time period, all the Jews, all the farmers and artisans and craftsmen and shopkeepers, all of the Jews took 2 months off during the year to go to the yeshiva and to study. Tens of thousands of Jews from all across the Jewish communities would leave their lives and leave their families and leave their jobs and go to the yeshiva, to the Masifta, to the house of scholarship to study twice a year. In fact, the Talmud describes that during one of these episodes, there were so many people that when they all got up at the same time, they all lifted the dust from beneath their feet, and there was such a cloud of dust that was raised that they couldn't see the sky. It got dark. It was midday and suddenly it's dark because of all the cloud. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but that shows kind of the magnitude of these conventions, and also the integration that Torah had amongst the nation. Indeed, we could say that during this time we see a fulfillment of the Torah-itic requirement to study Torah all the time, at the markets, on the road, at all the gatherings, in the mornings and in the nights. And indeed, the heroes of the people of the time are the great Torah scholars, and the people that were ignorant to Torah were the lowest of the low. And in fact, those people were consumed with envy, not of the rich people, but of the people that were great Torah scholars. So for example, Rabbi Akiva started his life as an Am Ha'aretz. He was ignorant. And later on, once he became the greatest sage of the people, he told his students that when I was an Am Ha'aretz, when I was ignorant, I used to hope and yearn that I could find a Torah scholar and I could bite him like a donkey. So the student said, you bite like a dog, you don't bite like a donkey. So he said, no. A dog bites and doesn't break any bones. I had such envy, I was so consumed with misery towards the Torah scholars, I wanted to bite them like a donkey and break their bones. We learn about the commitment of Torah scholars at the time. So great stories. Hillel himself, when he was poor, he was a wood chopper. Before he risen to the status of the Nasi, of the leader of the people, he was a wood chopper, and he would take his money that he makes every day, split it in half. Half would be for his wife and family, and the other half would be to pay admission to go to the yeshiva. In fact, one time he didn't have enough money to be allowed admittance and entry into the yeshiva, and he climbed into the roof to be able to put his ear by the skylight to hear what the rabbis were teaching. And in fact, it started snowing, and we know the story. It started snowing, and he was unconscious. And then the rabbis are like, wait, it's kind of dark in there. And they see the silhouette of Hillel sleeping unconscious on the roof. And they come take him down, and they warm him up, and they take care of him. But that's one story that we know. There's many others here. We know that the dedication that they had to Torah scholarship at that time was unimaginable. Rabbi Akiva, the aforementioned Rabbi Akiva, he abandoned his wife and family for 24 years to study Torah. She said, go study Torah for 12. After 12 years, he came back home, And then he overhears his wife from the other side of the door saying, if my husband was over here, I would tell him to go back for another 12 years. So he turns around and heads back. As to whether or not he walked in and said hi and spent the night there is a big debate. But either way, we see like this, yeah, it was just immersion, total national immersion in Torah study, dedication to it as well. The Talmud tells of one of the rabbis, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi. He wanted to study a particular issue, and he lived far away from the yeshiva. So he traveled for 3 months, taking caravans, and probably was a very dangerous and perilous journey to get to the yeshiva, to get to the house of scholarship. He was there for 1 day, and he turned back, and he got his answer to the question that he needed, and he went back and headed home after his day of scholarship. And another story, just one more quick story of Rav Preda. Rabbi Preda was one of the rabbis, and he was teaching students, and he had one slow student that no matter how many times you explained to him, he didn't get it. So he would sit there and repeat it to him again and again. And every day they had a tradition that they would do it 400 times, and the 400th time the student finally got it, and the session was completed. So one time, the rabbi is teaching a student, and then someone comes in and says, oh, I have to talk to you about something. So the rabbi tells him, I'm sorry, I'm still teaching my student. Why don't you wait till I'm done? So he finishes 400 times, and the student says, I still don't get it. He says, why? We did 400 times. Why don't you get it? So he says, well, the whole time I see the guy here waiting for you, and I'm worried that maybe you're going to leave, and I can't concentrate. So he says, you know what? We're going to do another 400 times. And he did it a total of 800 times, and the student finally got it. But this showed that the people equated their life, their meaning, their purpose with Torah study. And that is a dramatic change from what happened prior. The nation has kind of got back to its roots and what's really important. And of course, the method of study really demanded this kind of immersion. Remember, at that time, the Torah, the written Torah, of course, is a written document, but the oral Torah, the bulk of the corpus of Torah study, is all given orally. You go to your teacher, and he teaches you, and you have to memorize tremendous volumes of information. So indeed, this is the only way that the Torah can flourish. And of course, such a system of having hundreds of thousands of students engaging in such dedication to Torah study really creates tremendous geniuses, prodigious, and people of titanic intellect really emerge during this time. So for example, some more stories. We'll get to them later.
Is this going to be? Is this in Babylon? Or is
this is everywhere. This is everywhere. This is both places. Yes. Okay. Now, the Talmud tells of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. He would ask questions. They would debate. They would discuss. And every question he would answer, his study partner would give him. Every question he would ask, his study partner would give him 24 answers. They had such deep knowledge of Torah that they were able to answer, one question with 24 different perspectives. The Talmud tells of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir had 150 arguments to purify a sheretz. A sheretz is a creepy crawler animal that is not pure. But Rabbi Meir says he had such tremendous mastery over Torah that he was able to prove it with 150 proofs that it was indeed pure. Additionally, the Talmud tells of Rabbi Akiva, of course, the greatest scholar of his day, that he would, he once encountered someone who brought him 300 proofs that Saras Habas, a very obscure part of Torah, where there's a Levirate marriage in the form of two brothers, and one of them is married to two women, and one of those women is the daughter of the first brother, and then he dies, and there's another brother. Very complicated question. And this guy said, I have 300 proofs one way, and Rabbi Akiva just answers them all one after another. Just tremendous mastery over Torah was achieved by the leaders of those times. So to answer your question, Dave, yes, there were multiple Torah centers in Israel and in Babylon, and indeed we find many episodes where the scholars would go back and forth. There was a vibrant atmosphere of Torah scholarship, and very frequently open the Talmud tells stories. When this rabbi came, where did he come? He came to Babylon. because the great Torah scholars wouldn't be happy and content with only studying from one rabbi in one institution. They would go to other rabbis and other institutions to get as much of an education as possible.
What year was this?
We're talking about from the year 70, really till the year 500. That's kind of the golden era of the Talmud and Mishnah. The rebuilding of the Jewish community was very fast. Every Jewish community would send their best and brightest students to Yavne, to the Sanhedrin, and there was a robust atmosphere of Torah study. And now the Sanhedrin, they undertook another critical mission to help save the Jewish people. It was becoming clear that the rest of Jewish history would have a lot of instability and lack of peace and security. So they wanted to ensure that they were able to preserve Torah in its pristine format as best as they could. So right away, on the heels of the destruction of the Second Temple, the process of trying to clarify every law, every halacha, began. For example, the Talmud tells that they spent 3 years debating as to whether or not the law follows the house of Shammai or the house of Hillel. The house of Shammai and Hillel were two institutions that had about 315 some odd, around that number, disagreements in all areas of Torah. So in Yavne, in the Sanhedrin, right after the temple's destroyed, they said, okay, now is the time to figure out which one of these is halacha. And what was the most important thing for them at the time was to ensure that there's unity, that there's no schisms, that the life that they abandoned before the temple, where there were so many different factions and so many different sectarianistic schisms, that we're doing away with. From now on, we want to have a unified people, and let's try to ensure that that we don't have disagreements. So, like one story that illustrates that is that the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was, of course, the elder sage from before the temple era, he was around 100 years old, but he wasn't the Nasi, he wasn't the head of the Sanhedrin, he wasn't the head of the Jewish people. So he came to Yavne along with all the other scholars after the temple's destroyed, but he left. And the reason why he left, because the Nasi, the president, the prince of the people, was a fellow by the name of Rabbi Gamliel. And Rabbi Gamliel was significantly younger. So he was scared that his presence in Yavne is going to compromise Rabbi Gamliel's leadership. Because everyone says, well, yeah, you're the prince, so to speak, of the Sanhedrin, but we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Rabbi Zakkai voluntarily picked up and moved out of the way. So there's one episode that really demonstrates the effort that was taken to ensure that there was unity and that the Sanhedrin's authority was not questioned. This is the famous story of Rabbi Eliezer and the serpentine oven. There was a debate that came before the Sanhedrin as to the purity status of a certain oven. Apparently the oven was made of a certain material, but it got cracked and that was put back together. Is it or is it not susceptible to purity? Very, obviously, arcane question that's not really relevant to us every day. But that was a question that came before the Sanhedrin in Yavne when they were trying to clarify all the laws. So the way they approached every law, and this one as well, is that they would debate and analyze it from every vantage point, and all the great brilliant minds of the Sanhedrin would butt heads and argue and debate over, and then they would have a vote, and they would follow the majority. The majority vote would rule. Well, the majority vote came that it was indeed impure. But there was a dissenter. The dissenter was Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Hyrcanus. He was one of the greatest rabbis and most brilliant Torah scholars of his time. And he refused to accept the ruling of the Sanhedrin. He said, I'm right, and the Sanhedrin is wrong, despite the fact that the Sanhedrin, the majority, went with the wrong opinion. And he resisted the Sanhedrin. So listen to what happened. He goes and makes a declaration in the house of scholarship, in the middle of the Sanhedrin. He says, if I'm right, let the tree outside uproot itself. And everyone is bamboozled when they see the tree outside, actually lift itself up and move 100 yards away and replant itself. Just a miracle. Like, how does he do it, right? And then he brings proofs. He says, if I'm right, let the river start flowing the opposite direction, and the river starts flowing the opposite direction. If I'm right, let the heavens announce it, and everyone hears a prophetic, booming voice. Rabbi Eliezer is right. Why are you guys arguing with him? And lastly, he tells them, if I'm right, let the walls of the house of scholarship prove it, and before you know it, the walls start caving in. And what's going to be? So they make a decision that Rabbi Eliezer is a threat to the Jewish people because he is allowing division and discord to infiltrate the Jewish people by not accepting completely the decision of the Sanhedrin, and they decided to actually excommunicate him. So think about this. The greatest rabbi, arguably the greatest rabbi of his day, is arguing with the majority and refuses to accept the position of the majority. And they say, okay, you're excommunicated. People can't talk to you. People cannot come into close contact with you. You're a pariah. And indeed, Rabbi Gamliel, who oversaw that, was actually Rabbi Eliezer's brother-in-law. And indeed, at that time, Rabbi Gamliel was on a ship heading to Rome. Remember, he was the Nasi, the prince of the Jewish people, and he was the leader, the religious leader, but also the political leader. And he was heading to Rome to engage in some sort of negotiations, and the waters became super choppy. And everyone's like, oh, we're about to crash, and all drowned. And Gamliel announces, says, God, I know that the reason why you're doing this is because of what I did to Rabbi Eliezer. But you should know I didn't do it for myself, for my own honor, for the honor of my family, for the house of Hillel. I did it to ensure that there's no disunity among the people. And when he said that, the waters quieted. And of course, this is a very tragic story, but this really demonstrates what the motivation behind the people in the Sanhedrin in Yavne was. Now is a time for rebuilding. Now is a time for mending any divisions amongst the nations. What brought us to the destruction, what brought about the destruction, was disunity and fighting and infighting amongst the people. That has to end. And if we even find a hint of disunity and refusal to accept the central authority, then automatically you're pariahified. Now, with this new leadership and this new national mission, the Jewish people rebuilt themselves very fast, and 40 years later, they were essentially as strong as they were, and perhaps even stronger. And of course, this was not pleasantly received by the Romans, and this is once again a pattern we see in Jewish history, where the Jews, the Almighty allows us to get beaten down, of course not to ever get destroyed. We get beaten down, and then everyone who looks at our situation says, okay, that's it, they're just going to die. That's it. How could they possibly come back from such devastation? And of course, we always do. We always come back with tenacity. But the Romans were not happy about that, and they were looking for any excuse to once again massacre the multitudes of Jews as they did prior. And they found their excuse in the year 115. 115, of course, Trajan is the emperor. He waged battle in Parthia against the Babylonians. The local Babylonian Jews, they came to the aid of their countrymen against the Romans. So the Romans decided that because the Jews in Babylon defended the Babylonian Empire from the Roman incursions, that demonstrated that the Jews everywhere throughout the Roman Empire were disloyal. So they began massacres in many, many, many cities. Chief among them was the biggest city of the time, the biggest Jewish city of the time, city of Alexandria. And in fact, in Cyprus, which was also under the thumb of the Romans, they actually destroyed the entire Jewish community. And the reverberations of tragedy and desolation and destruction did not stop there. In the year 117, the Emperor Hadrian, so he was the adopted son of Trajan, he assumed power. Now initially, he was very friendly to the Jews. He would rebuild Jewish communities, he would rebuild shuls and Jewish homes, and he even proposed to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and to rebuild, of course, the city of Jerusalem. For whatever reason, he changed his attitude in a complete 180. And he instituted crippling decrees that forbid really any sort of Jewish practice. And in fact, if you look back to what happened 300 years prior, when Antiochus IV forbade many areas of Jewish practice, Hadrian did almost identical. So he forbid the laws of Nida. Teaching of Torah publicly was forbidden. Observing Shabbat was forbidden. Circumcision was forbidden. Of course, the non-Jews are always revolted by that mitzvah. And in fact, he forced Jews that were circumcised to reverse their circumcision. He did indeed decide to rebuild Jerusalem, but instead of rebuilding it for the Jews, he rebuilt it as a city for the pagan god of Jupiter. And in fact, he renamed it Aelia Capitolina, which is not kind of very distant from the name Jerusalem that it had prior. And of course, he did the unthinkable. He made an actual temple to the idol on Temple Mount. And Jews were barred from entering Jerusalem on pain of death. Of course, all this led to people very disheartened and disappointed with that. And it led to the most successful rebellion and revolt in all of Roman history. Of course, that is the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a very bloody and horrible war for both sides. It was led by a fellow by the name of Shimon Bar Kokhba, otherwise called Bar Koziva. He was a man of tremendous physical strength and also a great Torah scholar. He bred an army of real macho men. In fact, to join the army, you had to either prove your courage by cutting off one of your fingers. When the rabbi said, that's not really the way Jews do things, he said, okay, we'll relax the standards. All you have to do is uproot a tree while riding a horse. Simple. And he assembled a tremendously successful army. Initially, they started guerrilla warfare, attacking the Romans from behind and attacking from caves. And ultimately, they even were brazen enough to take on the Romans in open battle. Their numbers swelled. They had initially a small ragtag group. Eventually, it grew. There were up to 200,000, even 350,000 by different accounts. And they were successful in recapturing Jerusalem. So the city that was destroyed, rebuilt by Hadrian for the pagans, and now recaptured by the Jews. And plans were made to rebuild the temple. And everyone was so excited. And in fact, Rabbi Akiva was one of his supporters. And Rabbi Akiva was the one who gave him the name Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba means the son of the star, a reference to the scripture that talks about Messiah is Darach Kochov Yaakov. A star is going to emerge from Jacob. And Rabbi Akiva was fairly positive that Bar Kokhba was that guy, and thus he named him such. Now, if you want to know what a Torah army looks like, what would a Torah army? An army of soldiers dedicated to Torah. So it's interesting, in the 60s, they found letters in the caves all across southern Israel that were from Bar Kokhba. So of course they found lots of military dispatches and the like. But they also found a letter from Bar Kokhba where he writes, well, the holiday of Sukkot is upcoming. And we have to find Lulavim and Esrogim. We have to find the 4 species of the mitzvah of the holiday for our many soldiers. That's in fact the letter that we actually have today. Now eventually things went south. It went south kind of quickly. And our sages tell us that what happened was that that Bar Kokhba really told God, listen, you don't have to help me in my battles, that I'm being victorious. I don't really need your help, just don't help the enemies. And when he kind of abandoned God, so to speak, and relied on his own might, that was the beginning of his downfall. So Hadrian called his greatest general, a fellow by the name of Julius Severus. He was in Britain at the time, and he brought him in to quell and repel the revolt. What he did, of course, as is common with, we've seen previous conquests of Israel, he wouldn't try to attack all of Israel at once. He began piecemeal, town after town, until eventually they recaptured Jerusalem. And the forces of Bar Kokhba, they fortified themselves in a famous city called Beitar. That's a little bit south of Jerusalem. There was a siege for many years, and for whatever reason, the Romans couldn't figure out, but the city was able to withstand the siege. And the truth is that there were secret passageways in and out of the city that the people would smuggle food and provisions in through. What happened was someone, no one really knows who, but someone betrayed the city and revealed to the Romans where the entrances were. They sealed the entrances. So now they were like a caged bird. They were trapped. Now, Bar Kokhba, he immediately accused his own uncle, one of the great rabbis of the time, a fellow by the name of Rabbi Elazar Hamodai. He accused him of the treachery and betrayal, and he had him killed. And once he did that, he kind of got so far away from the normative position of the people that all the rabbis abandoned him. And in fact, while he was previously called Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, they ended up calling him Bar Koziva, the son of a lie, because there was a tremendous deception. And that indeed is something we see again with false messiahs, that they have this peak. Everyone gets caught up in the dream that they sell, but ultimately leaves them with a really bad aftertaste. And we find out in retrospect that it was all a lie. The fall of Beitar was a calamity of such proportions that it rivaled the destruction of Jerusalem itself. In fact, according to Jewish and Roman sources, the number of dead was more than 500,000. Tremendous slaughter and massacre. The Talmud describes it, that there were streams of blood that were so vast that the local Gentile farmers didn't need to fertilize their fields for 7 years, because of the amount, just the volume of blood that was just streaming from the dead of Beitar. Not only the revolt was primarily because of what the Hadrianic persecutions. He forbade Torah study, etc. Now, the dead of Beitar were not allowed to be buried. So for years and years, there were just piles and piles of dead bodies just decomposing. And in fact, the Talmud tells us that a miracle happened and the bodies did not rot. And in fact, there is actually a blessing, the fourth of the blessings in the Birkat Hamazon, in the after meal prayer, is a blessing of thanking God for this miracle. After the fall of Beitar and the destruction of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian intensified and re-intensified his attempts to destroy the Jewish people. He, once again, with new vigor, forbade Jewish practices. For example, he forbade the conferring of smicha. Smicha is rabbinic ordination. To be part of the Sanhedrin, you had to have smicha. Smicha meant that you received conferring of rabbinic ordination from someone who got it from someone all the way back to Moses. In fact, the Torah tells us that Moses, samach yado, he placed his hands on Joshua and conferred his stature upon Joshua, and that continued throughout the generations. And to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you have to have smicha. So what Hadrian realized was that if you stop conferring smicha, then the Sanhedrin can no longer fill its ranks, and you'll destroy the Jewish people. So he said, if anyone gives smicha, anyone confers smicha to someone else, the rabbi who gives it and the rabbi who receives it will both be executed. And not only that, the city in which the smicha was conferred, the entire city would be decimated. So Talmud tells us, Talmud in Baba Basra 14a tells of one of the great heroes, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, I think his name was, where he risked his life to give smicha to 5 students. What did he do? He went between 2 cities, exactly between 2 cities. It wasn't inside any city. It wasn't close to any city. He quickly gave them smicha. Of course, when the enemies of the Jews informed on him, the Romans came and descended upon them. But by that time, the 5 students had escaped. And while they killed the rabbi in tremendously brutal fashion, they actually punctured him with spears like a net. But he kind of kept the Sanhedrin alive a little bit longer. In going with this theme of attacking the rabbinate and the clergy of the people, he went after the leaders. So, for example, Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, famous martyr, he was teaching Torah against Hadrian's rule, and they took him, they wrapped him in a Torah scroll and lit them both on fire. The Talmud tells that story. Rabbi Akiva was told, once again, like everyone else, you teach Torah publicly, you're going to get executed. And he said, well, if we abandon Torah, we abandon our lifeblood. So it's like telling a fish, leave the water and you'll be safe. Well, if you're not in the water, then you're dead anyhow. That's what he told his detractors. He taught Torah. They caught him. They imprisoned him, and ultimately they killed him in a really, really brutal and horrific manner by flaying his skin. While Hadrian did tremendous acts of brutality to the leaders, he didn't stop there. He wanted to eradicate the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. He renamed the entirety of Judea, what was called Judea, or in ancient times called Israel. He renamed it Philistinia, after the ancient Philistines that we learned about last time. The big cities, like I said, Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina. Shechem, the biblical city of Shechem, he renamed it Neapolis, new city. And of course, Arabs have a hard time pronouncing the P sound, so Neapolis became the modern city of Nablus. Not only that, he took Temple Mount and he actually had it raised with a Z. In fact, Temple Mount was actually once a tremendously high mountain, and he had it raised, by some estimates, 1,000 feet lower than it was prior. In the aftermath of this Bar Kokhba rebellion and the Hadrianic persecutions, there were really two major revelations. Number one, that the notion that existed prior, that you could reinstitute Jewish sovereignty over Israel via armed resistance against the Romans, that everyone realized was not going to happen. But also, the reality really set in that there's going to be a lot of instability in the Jewish future. They can never again assume that they can live in peace and security while under Roman rule. Now, that alone is terrifying, but the implications of that is even more terrifying. Because if the Jewish people cannot have a certain modicum of peace and stability, the oral Torah that demanded dedication and patience and time under tutelage of scholars, well, that's now imperiled as well. If you can't teach Torah publicly. Not only that, you're living under tremendous hostile environment and hostile conditions. Well, how are we going to ensure that the next generation is able to study Torah? And indeed, at that time, we meet one of the transformative individuals in Jewish history, and perhaps the most transformative event in Jewish history at that time. In the year 161, a fellow by the name of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus assumed emperorship of Rome. He bucked the trend of hostile leaders to the Jewish people. In fact, he was actually very, very warm and friendly to the Jewish people. So much so that we know that he actually has debates between Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Judah the Prince was the Nasi at the time, the leader of the Jewish people at the time, and the head of the Sanhedrin. They were actually friends and colleagues. The Talmud records several debates that they used to have. They used to talk, they used to study. One Talmud says is that they installed a tunnel from one of Antoninus's palaces to Rabbi Judah the Prince's house. There was a tunnel, a subterranean tunnel installed, and every day Antoninus would sneak out of his palace onto the tunnel and go study Torah with Rabbi Judah the Prince. They were actually very, very friendly. And this unique individual, who was, number one, the greatest Torah scholar of his time, number two, was the recognized authority, political and rabbinic authority of his time, and also someone who was exceptionally wealthy, Rabbi Judah the Prince. Couple that with agreeable Roman leadership, a monumental effort to write down Jewish law, what we know as the Mishnah, was undertaken. Rabbi Judah the Prince and the Sanhedrin convened thousands of rabbis and scholars from around the world, and they undertook the effort to write down an authoritative, canonized, codified, finalized document that can be studied very quickly of all of Jewish law. In fact, the product of their work is the basis of all Jewish law that came afterwards. In fact, it was a collection of 63 books that we still have and study today. Now, why did he do it? So the Rambam tells us in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, that is. He writes as follows. And why did Rabbi Judah the Prince write down the Mishnah and not leave it as it had been prior? Because he saw that the students were becoming fewer and fewer. Calamities were continually happening. The wicked government, reference to Rome, was extending its domain and increasing its power, and the Israelites, the Jewish people, were wandering and reaching remote places. He thus wrote a work to serve as a handbook for all, so it could be rapidly studied and would not be forgotten. Throughout his life, he and his court continued giving public instruction in the Mishnah. This decision, at this point in history, saved the Jewish people. We know over the course of the history that's going to follow, the leadership is going to get weaker. The amount of persecutions is going to be happening with more intensity and more frequency. And who is going to ensure that the Jewish people are going to still be connected to Torah? Remember, you disassociate the Jewish people from Torah, you disassociate the Jewish people from their heritage and their destiny. And if they're not connected to Torah, then the great mission that began all the way back with Abraham is going to be impossible to fulfill. So he made this radical decision in this shift to take a Torah that was really only accessible with continued intense study under the tutelage of a rabbi, and now he made a handbook, a shortened version that is written and copied, that could be given to anyone anywhere. At this point in time, the Jewish people recognized that they're no longer going to have a homeland. The dreams of reestablishing sovereignty and hegemony over Israel are really fleeting. They're really non-existent and not going to be revived until the 19th century, 1,800 years later. Precisely 1,700 years later. But they're going to have now a portable homeland. What's going to keep the Jews connected to Jewry, to the Jewish brethren, to Torah? It's going to start with the Mishnah, and it's going to culminate, of course, in the Talmud and the writings that came afterwards. Torah was flourishing in Israel. Torah, of course, now once the Mishnah was written, was flourishing in Babylon. And of course, once the Mishnah was written, the first component of the oral Torah was committed to paper. The process that would take ultimately 300 years of writing down the next segment of the oral Torah, what's known as the Talmud, that began in earnest in Israel and in Babylon. So the Talmud is a little bit different than the Mishnah, whereas the Mishnah is just the laws. The Talmud includes all the explanations behind the laws, all the sources, how those oral Torah laws, how are they connected back to the written Torah, many examples of applications of laws, of course many exceptions, and lots of debate of how they got there. The Talmud was written twice. It was written once in the 4th century, was finalized in the 4th century in Israel. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud. Of course, Jerusalem was a city devoid of Jews. The Jewish people were actually primarily in northern Israel, the Galilee, and the Jerusalem Talmud was written in Tiberias, but they called it the Jerusalem Talmud because they still felt a connection to Jerusalem, even though it was a city that was not full, that had no Jews in it at the time. About 150 years later, the Babylonian Talmud was written in Babylon. And now, when we study Talmud, we generally study the Babylonian Talmud, A, because it came later, more perspective, more argumentation, and more development, and B, because it also incorporates the opinions of the dissenters. If you want to study it with the same flavor and dynamic discussions and debates that really enliven the Torah, you study the Babylonian Talmud, because it really connects you emotionally and intellectually to the world of Torah that existed at the time. Of course, in the pages of the Talmud, we read about the great heroes of the time: Rav, Shmuel, Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan was the most critical contributor to the Jerusalem Talmud. Abaye and Rava, this tag team appears more than any other tag team in the Talmud. Rava more than anyone else, and of course, Rav Ashi and Ravina. They're the ones who actually undertook the effort to actually write down the Babylonian Talmud. Each one of these individuals were titans, were giants. Each one of them, we could spend a whole time, maybe an hour or 2 or 5, talking about them and learning about their character. And they're worthy of their own analysis and appreciation, but of course in our format, we have to move on. So the two major themes we see in this period is, number one, the shift in leadership from what it was prior to Torah leadership and also to Torah immersion, and of course that is reflected in the Mishnah and the Talmud. Another major theme of this era is the rise of companion Abrahamic faiths. So if you remember, we spoke about, the first time we talked about Jewish history, we talked about dividing up Jewish history into three distinct eras. We have the era of chaos, of confusion, where God is not known of the world, and then we meet the era of Torah, where Abraham changes the chaos and introduces the idea of God to the world. And the last 2,000 years is called the era of Messiah. Messiah is taking the ideas of the Jewish people, the ideas of Abraham, the ideas of one God, and disseminating it to the entire world. So we see very clearly at this point in history that the Jewish ideals start to resonate amongst the greater population. It's almost overnight, whereas despite the fact that Jews prior were living in close proximity to the Greeks and to the Romans, to the Babylonians, to the Persians, to the Assyrians, the ideas of the Jews didn't take hold. The Jews were, they were such an exotic religion. The idea of one God, disavowing any forms of idolatry and paganism, was so radical for the people at the time. At the beginning of the first century, with the rise of Christianity, and when it finally really became a major player in the world scene in the 3rd and 4th centuries, we see a change. Suddenly the ideas of the Jewish people begin to gain international and universal acclaim. So the backstory of Jewish history, of Christianity, early Christianity, we learned last time that during the 1st century of the Common Era, many different sects arise amongst the people. The Sadducees were already existing prior. The Essenes were like a splinter group of the Jewish people. They introduced new texts to their religion, new laws. It was kind of Judaism plus whatever. Now, Christianity began as one of those sects. But they introduced, on top of Judaism, they introduced a fascination with their messianic character. Of course, another pattern in Jewish history is the notion that when things are really bad and bleak and gloomy, the hopes for salvation in the form of messianic redemption are at their highest. Things were really bad for the Jewish people in the 1st century of the Common Era, and when they found a charismatic leader to their cause, the early Christians, they married Judaism with a fascination with the JC character, and that was early Christianity. Now, early Christianity was really no different than Judaism. Was no different than Judaism. They observed the Torah, and they observed the Shabbat, observed all the laws. They had circumcision. It was exclusively for Jews. They were not accepting at all of the non-Jews. And all they had was a belief that their deceased hero was the Messiah and that he's somehow coming back to save them. Now, the problem with that, or maybe the reality of that situation, was that it was really not going to take hold in a major way, because the Jews felt it was a diluted version of Judaism. They were tampering with Judaism. The non-Jews felt that it's way too restrictive, it's too cumbersome to have all of Judaism as well. So it was kind of in the middle. It didn't really have much of a following. All that was going to change when Judaism and Christianity were bifurcated into two separate religions. Of course, the founder of their religion is not the JC character, but it's Paul. Paul, he abrogated the law. That's his. What he did was he took Judaism and Christianity and separated them. He said that to be a Christian, you no longer need to be Jewish. You no longer need to be circumcised. You no longer need to observe the law. And thus he made a clear line in the sand between Judaism and Christianity. And that's actually a tremendous benefit for the Jewish people, because prior you wouldn't know if your neighbor who goes to shul next to you and eats exclusively kosher and looks like a Jew and dresses like a Jew and talks like a Jew, you wouldn't know if he's a closet Christian. And in fact, during the history of early Christianity, the Jewish people had to develop these methods to weed out the closet Christians. So we know that the Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings, is actually 19. If you actually count the blessings, it's actually 19 blessings. It's called 18 because initially it was 18 blessings. But during the era of the early Christianity, they innovated, they added a new blessing, the 19th blessing, and that was used to weed out the heretics. The way the blessing actually goes is that all the heretics, which is referring to the early Christians, they should all be destroyed. And what they would do is, anyone that they suspected who's a closet Christian, a Judeo-Christian, they would say, oh, why don't you go lead the services? Go ahead. And the guy's like, well, my throat's hurting a little bit. Okay, the next day, like, well, you sound pretty fine. Go lead the services. And if the person will continually resist to lead the services because they don't want to curse themselves and they're co-religionists, then they would know that that guy's a closet Christian. But now Paul comes along, and it's actually a tremendous benefit for the Jewish people because now there are two distinct religions. Christianity took a long time to gain mass appeal. The Romans despised the Christians and persecuted them as they did the Jewish people. But of course, in the beginning of the 4th century, Constantine, who would go on to become the emperor of Rome, he converted to Christianity and it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, the beginning of the Roman Empire adoption of Christianity really is a mark in the sand for Christian persecution and hostility towards the Jewish people. From this point on, the Jewish people are going to have to contend with all the other challenges that they had prior, plus a competing, so to speak, religion that is hell-bent on destruction of the Jewish people. Now, that's not the only Abrahamic faith that really emerges at that time. While it took the Christians several hundred years to take over all of the Roman Empire and to become a great monotheistic religion, Islam, they had a meteoric ascension like never seen before. Muhammad died in the year 632, and by 711, a very easy date for Americans to remember, by 711, they have already captured Spain. So they've already reached all the way across Europe and captured all of that. So while we look at this development as a fulfillment of 2,000 years of Messiah, where the Jewish ideals are going to start to be disseminated in mass to the world at large, via kind of our cousins, because Ishmael is the other son of Abraham and the father of the Arabs and the Muslims. And by the way, the Muslims right away lead themselves back to Ishmael. The Christians descend from Esau, from Edom. So thus, it's almost our cousins are partnering with us in disseminating the Abrahamic principles throughout the world. But it also brought tremendous challenges. From then on, the Jewish people have to contend with these two mighty world religions that were not only hostile to the Jewish people, but were warring with each other. Whenever the Christians and the Muslims fight, there's always us right in the middle to receive the brunt of the terror from both of them. And indeed, we could say that future Jewish history is dominated by the question, how are the Jews going to manage living under the thumb of their Christian and Islamic rulers? So looking back at this point in history, if you were to prognosticate, if you were to telegraph what would happen to the Jewish people after the temple's destroyed and after Jerusalem's destroyed, you would say in all likelihood things are really heading south very fast. Of course, that would have happened if not for the heroes of the Sanhedrin, if not for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who had the foresight to ensure that the people in Yavne, the rabbis in Yavne, would be spared, and the people in Yavne to rebuild, to ensure unity, to have the Sanhedrin, to be able to have the wherewithal to keep on trucking forward despite the terrors of Trajan and Hadrian, and of course Rabbi Judah the Prince, who wrote down the Mishnah, and Ravina Rashi, who wrote down the Talmud, and the fact that they were able to take all of Torah, the entire mass of Jewish knowledge, and convert that or to commit that to writing in a way that all of Torah was preserved for eternity, really ensured that the Jewish people will survive and thrive and flourish. But of course, it's not going to be easy. Next time, we're going to discuss what's going to be the status of the Jewish people during the medieval times. And that's that. Any questions?
Yeah, but I forgot.
You forgot your questions?
I had one too, but I don't remember.
So before the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin was composed of priests?
No. Well, some yes, some no. But it was.
And after it was just composed of rabbis?
No, the Sanhedrin was composed of the Torah authorities, always. Of course, but the priests had their domain in the form of leadership of control of the temple. So the temple was controlled by the priests, and the high priest, of course. The office of the high priest was a major institution of leadership amongst the people.
So it sounds like back then, in those days, the context was to divide and conquer. Was to conquer your neighbor, including the Israelites would conquer their neighbor.
Not so much. There were some episodes of that. Certainly during the time of Joshua, there were efforts to try to conquer all of Israel. Maybe the Hasmoneans did some of that as well. But the Jews, they didn't have any national homeland. They didn't have control. They didn't have any sovereignty over Israel or really anywhere. You know, from Pompey, from the year I think 63 before the Common Era, when the Romans come to Israel, when did they have sovereignty? They had 3 years under Bar Kokhba. How did that work out for them?
Yeah, but what I'm bringing up is that after the Christian Messiah, and when Paul started to,
Yes.
before he did the separation of Jews and Christians,
Yes.
the closet Jews, or closet Christians, excuse me, the Jews were against.
Well, because they were deceiving their brethren. You know, for someone to present themselves as one kind of person,
Yeah.
but to secretly be someone else is a problem. And of course, you have to use subterfuge to weed those people out, because people are very dangerous. What happens if, you know, your neighbor, really nice guy, and you know, and someone says, hey, he has a daughter, you have a son, why don't you guys get married? You know, but how terrifying would that be if he's really a Christian? You don't know. So that's why it's actually a
Or
benefit
how
for us.
terrifying it would
It's a
be
benefit
if
for
he was
us because now we know who's who. We know who's Jewish. We know who's Christian. In fact, there is a Jewish tradition that Paul was actually loyal to the Jewish people all the way to the end.
Really?
There is a tradition that Paul was actually sent in as a fifth column to infiltrate the Christians in order to change them from within. There is that theory because of the benefit that it brought to the Jewish people. Yes.
How far was it between Babylon and where the Jews were living in Israel? Was that a one-day travel?
That's a multi-day travel.
Okay, because you said they were interacting.
Oh, they would interact, but there was a perilous journey to go from Israel to Babylon and vice versa.
And Akiva lived where?
Rabbi Akiva lived in Israel, northern Israel. Yes. Rabbi Akiva traveled everywhere.
Did he study with Hillel?
No, he comes a little bit. He's like the next generation. He's the next generation.
Hillel lived in Babylon.
Hillel lived and moved to Israel. Rabbi Akiva actually traveled a lot. He traveled a lot. He went as far as to Africa because he had a problem. He didn't know what the definition of a certain word is, so he had to find an African tribe that they would know of it. He spent some time in Babylon as well. But Rabbi Akiva lived a very long life and a very colorful life. I think when we talk about when we do the Jewish history in depth, we can actually have a whole class on Rabbi Akiva, go through all the sources.
One more, I'll let you go.
No, don't, as many questions as you want.
In Babylon, we were flourishing, right? At that time.
Yes, the Jewish people in Babylon pretty much, for the duration, from when they got there after the first temple, until they left in the 50s, until they left in the 1950s and went to Israel, were all airlifted to Israel.
Really? Okay.
It was pretty good for most of the time. Pretty
And
good.
where is Babylon?
Babylon is modern day Iraq.
Is where? Near
Iraq.
Iraq.
Yeah, modern day Iraq, yeah.
That's fascinating.
We have a lot more exciting stuff to look forward to during medieval times. It's
Thank you very much.
a lot of
You're
personalities.
taping this, like if I can't be here.
Oh yeah, of course. It's online and it's online. It's online in audio format and video format. Okay, I'll see everyone next time.
Good.
Nice.
Good, great class.